What are some cool history stories you don't hear in school? Story 1. Saved by a Button. A bizarre incident in 1704 might have seen G.F. Handel's composing career cut tragically short after a set-to with fellow composer Johann Montazon. For reasons apparently unknown, the two had a fierce quarrel in which Montazon almost killed Handel with his sword, which fortunately struck a brass button on Handel's chest rather than the chest itself. Had the metal button not saved Handel's life, his famous oratorio Messiah, with its Hallelujah chorus, would never have been composed. Story 2. The Odyssey of Helmut von Mucke during World War I. Dude got stranded with a boarding crew on an island in Indonesia, sailed across the Indian Ocean on a stolen Dutch boat, traveling through Arabia and Turkey while trying to not get involved in the Arab Revolt and finally getting home via Istanbul. Dude wrote a book about his adventures and became a pacifist because every one of his men he guided in this journey later died in the war. Story 3. I'm originally from Fiji. There's a phrase I love from a British general's journal which I will find as much opportunity to quote. Indians were brought to Fiji to work the fields by the British because these Fijians have no concept of industry. Once they have met their needs for the day, they simply leave and outrageously spend the rest of their time in leisure. Certain kinds of bosses haven't changed much, I reckon. Story 4. Belgian King Albert I. During World War I he actively took command of the Belgian military and at times was in the trenches with his men. As far as I'm aware he's the only king to do that during the First World War. He's a war hero. Sadly he's overshadowed by his predecessor Leopold II, known for the atrocities in Congo, and his successor Leopold III, who caused a major political divide after the Second World War that is still a problem to this day. Story 5. This is a short version of the story, but the White House, presidential building of the USA, got its name following the War of 1812. America failed to cross the Niagara River and invade Canada. The Canadian forces then crossed over the river, pushed the Americans back, and kept pushing deeper and deeper, all the way to the presidential building. They set it on fire. Afterwards, the building was repainted entirely white and thus became known as the White House. Story 6. It's more a fun history fact. I've recently read about Joseph Menšík, the last knight of Bohemia. He was a history buff from interwar Czechoslovakia. He lived in ruined castle near German borders, was teaching local children history and lived to medieval code of honor. In 1938 when Wehrmacht attacked his village, he took his armor on and mounted his horse. Then he rode out and blocked the road, Nazis though he's crazy, and let him live. He didn't achieve any victory, but the man definitely had balls of steel. These are the stories which are largely forgotten, but should be taught about. Single acts of bravery from people who decided to not give up. People like Menšík or the Tiananmen Square man show us that even a single human can resist evil. Story 7. This isn't talked about much because of how heartbreaking it is. That start World War II when Pearl Harbor was bombed in Hawaii, on one of the vessels that were bombed and sunk to the ocean floor actually had people alive in it locked in an airtight room. So for like 2 weeks there were these 2 to 4 people trapped in the airtight room. The military couldn't get them out because if they tried to open the room the pressure would kill the people inside instantly or something along those lines. Their screams could be heard when they yelled for help, and people were stationed to listen for when they stopped so they knew when the people had eat past. It was such a mental toll on the people stationed there that people literally couldn't do it. Their friends right there yet so far. After about 2 weeks, the screams stopped and they opened the room. They found the bodies and they had scratched tallies into the wall on how long they were there for. It was hard to tell if they had died from lack of water, food or ran out of oxygen. They were cremated and their ashes lie with the boat. War sucks. Story 8. The Blalock Tausig Shunt. The story of how this surgical procedure was developed and perfected by Dr. Blalock, but mostly Vivian Thomas his assistant. Thomas was a black man, who at the time was not allowed to perform surgeries on other human beings. When developing this procedure he worked mostly on dogs. When it came time to perform it on a human being, what started them developing this procedure was Dr. Tausig, a female pediatric cardiologist asking for help since she as a woman also couldn't operate on people. Thomas had to basically stand behind Blalock explaining what to do. There's a movie about all of this and their story called Something the Lord Made that goes into better detail. Also the podcast Sawbones does a 2-part episode about all this. It's a really beautiful story. Story 9. Paraguayan War. Solano Lopez took one of the poorest tactical decisions trying to fight the Brazilian Empire, Uruguay and Argentina at the same time and wiped out 90% of male adult population of his country. Sending the most industrialized country in the region back to the Dark Ages. Story 10. This might just be a small fun story but, here in Denmark there was once a man who lived in a cabinet on a beach. He came to Odysseys in 1914 and after 24 years he built a small shed around it, the cabinet. Formed thereon he lived in the shed till his death in 1956. Story 11. Vasily Arkhipov, the man who saved the world. Vasily Arkhipov was an officer in the Soviet Navy who was on board a submarine on a secret mission during the Cuban Missile Crisis. U.S. ships in a blockade fired non-lethal depth charges at the submarine in an attempt to get it to surface, but the people on the sub thought it was an attack. The sub was loaded with a nuclear torpedo. To fire the torpedo, usually you'd need the approval of the two commanding officers on the sub, and they did, but because Arkhipov was on board they needed his approval too, as he was the commander of the flotilla. He was the only one to disapprove the strike. He could have been on any other submarine at the time, but he was on that one. If he had fallen to peer pressure or had decided to go on to another submarine, the nuclear torpedo would have likely been fired, which would have probably triggered nuclear war. Story 12. Oh, I love these. My favorite is Lydia Dara. She lived in the time of the Revolutionary War, for America, and hosted British soldiers in her home because of the Quartering Act. She overheard them talking about some attack that was going to happen and pretended to go to the mill with an empty flour sack but went to go tell American soldiers. Another one that isn't good or cool in any way but I think should be taught in schools is the Wounded Knee Massacre. Look it up and learn a bit about it, especially if you're American. It's an important part of our history that everyone seems to overlook. No one I've talked to about it has even heard of it. Story 13. The original Robin Hood ballads were written in 1300s and there was no mention of Nottingham or Sherwood Forest. He was from Yorkshire. The reason this should be studied in schools is because up until these ballads were written, the English language was being suppressed by the French. These ballads are the oldest documents in the world written in Middle/Modern English. Any document before this was written in Old English/Anglo-Saxon and or Latin/French/Roman. Whoever wrote the original ballads of Robin Hood between 1350 to 1450 helped give birth to the English language we all know today. Story 14. John Brown should be idolized. A man who saw an unjust institution and decided to actually do something about rather than just speeches. Or as Douglas put it, his zeal in the cause of freedom was infinitely superior to mine. Mine was as the taper light, his was as the burning sun. Mine was bounded by time. His stretched away to the silent shores of eternity. I could speak for the slave. John Brown could fight for the slave. I could live for the slave. John Brown could die for the slave. Story 15. So I'm paraphrasing but James Lafayette. He was a slave during the American Revolutionary War who joined the Continental Army serving under General Lafayette. He ended up becoming a spy and because he could read and write he would infiltrate the British Army and copy down plans and return them to the American Army. It is believed that without his contribution the British would have won the war. After the war he returned to being a slave for 5 years. When he went to testify for his freedom, General Lafayette showed up to vouch for his contribution to the army, thus granting him his freedom. He took the last name of Lafayette in honor of his commanding officer who helped him get his freedom and treated him like an equal during the war. Story 16. There's a part of the US that actually belongs to Britain. In 1942 during the Second World War, even before we joined the war, we were giving Britain food and other supplies for the war. So far we had remained neutral, so Germany couldn't openly attack us. However, as soon as Japan declared war on us, so did Germany. Operation Drumbeat was Germany's plan to cut off supplies to Britain by attacking supply ships leaving the US with U-boats, submarines that were more effective in this task than in actual naval combat. It began on January 14, 1942, only a month after we joined the war. One of the big problems was that America didn't know what to do against them. Our navy wasn't very big or strong and we were completely uneducated on how to fight submarines. Because of this, President Roosevelt asked the Prime Minister of the UK, Winston Churchill, for assistance. He sent 24 ships from the Royal Navy over to patrol our east coast. One of these boats was the Bedfordshire, the other was the HMT Lowman. In February, these two boats were sent to patrol the Outer Banks, located in North Carolina and Virginia. 2 months passed and the two boats were still patrolling the shores. But on May 11, instead of them finding a U-boat, the U-boat found them. It shot torpedoes at both ships, but only the Bedfordshire was hit. The ship sank, and the crew drowned. 4 Englishmen's bodies washed up on the shore of Ocracoke Island. But we couldn't send them back to their homeland. Typically, those who die in war are sent back to their home country, but the isolated island of Ocracoke didn't have the materials to preserve the bodies. If they tried to send the Englishmen back, they would rot, and that's no way to treat men who had fought for their country and others. In respect to the sunken crew, the U.S. set a small patch of the island aside amounting to 0.052 acres of land. We leased it to the Commonwealth War Graves Commission in Britain, which keeps track of and maintains all of the graves for their soldiers who died in either of the world wars. It was done in perpetuity, for as long as the 4 men were buried in that memorial next to the town's cemetery. So, in other words, this small bit of land will forever be Britain. We still honor them today. In the beginning, the townspeople would take care of the gravesite themselves, just to thank the soldiers for their sacrifice. Now, the U.S. Coast Guard takes care of that. There are plaques that tell the story of what happened, another with the 37 people of the Bedfordshire's crew, and also a poem that was written by Rupert Brooke in 1914, 28 years before this happened. The poem reads this: "If I should die, think only this of me, that there's some corner of a foreign field. That is forever England." Every May 11th, there's a ceremony commemorating the sinking of the Bedfordshire. Every year a new Union Jack is sent over to fly over the memorial. Wreaths are laid on the graves while the U.S. Coast Guard pipe band plays. The villagers speak out the names of all 37 crew members. Then there's a bugle call, and after that, a 21-gun salute ends the ceremony. There's also a part where they mix water from the waters of Ocracoke Island, and water from the shores of the UK, to show the link between Ocracoke and Britain.